I've been hearing that the Silent Hill 2 remake underperforms on AMD GPUs, and with some of the benchmarks going around, that appears to be the case. It also appeared to be the case when I quickly glanced at the game on my RTX 4090 and 7900 XTX at native 4K Epic. With software lumen, the 4090 was 50% faster on the FPS averages, and with hardware lumen, it was 80% faster, which is a very big, unusual difference. But is there more to the story, and does the location matter? Well, we're gonna dig into it a bit more into this video, testing two different locations, multiple resolutions, and optimized settings. For this video, I'll be using my RX 6800 XT and RTX 3080 Ti, because these two GPUs are a lot closer to one another in performance than the 7900 XTX and 4090. That'll be the main focus anyway, but I'll also throw the 7900 XTX out of curiosity. So let's get into it. We're gonna start nice and easy with 1080p native, ray tracing off, so software lumen, and the Epic graphical preset. For this video, we're gonna actually exclude the 1% lows because the game has some stuttering issues. I don't feel it would be accurate to really look at those, but what we're gonna focus on instead is the average FPS. And we're gonna look at two different spots. Like I said, this beginning area, which is an area that a lot of benchmarkers have tested, but we're also gonna take a look at the other side, which is the twisted realm. And I'm actually glad that I decided to include that as well, even though it took me quite a bit longer to put all this together, is because the results can be kind of surprising once you go into that side. What we have here basically is the 3080 Ti averaging 72 FPS and the 6800 XT averaging 55 FPS. So that is a lead of 30% for the 3080 Ti. Now, these two GPUs, I've tested a ton of games and they're actually pretty close. The 3080 Ti is usually a bit faster on average, but it's not 30%. So this is definitely an unusual lead for the 3080 Ti over the 6800 XT. The 7900 XTX is averaging 94 FPS, which is a pretty nice lead over the other two, as you would expect. Alright, so now guys, we're on the other side. So I haven't actually made a ton of progress on the other side, just a little bit, but for the sake of this comparison, we're actually getting quite a bit more FPS here. Previously, we averaged only 72 FPS on the 3080 Ti, and here we averaged 90 FPS. And on the 6800 XT, we averaged 55 FPS in the forest. Here, we're averaging 74 FPS. So again, the 3080 Ti has a 32% lead here over the 6800 XT. It's pretty much the same as it was in the forest. For the 7900 XTX, that's averaging 115 FPS. So it's not really all that much more than the 3080 Ti, but I think we're actually a bit CPU bound here, so it's 1080p after all. And without ray tracing. Speaking of which, let's turn on ray tracing. Now before we jump to 1440p, let's take a look at 1080p, hardware ray tracing on, and the Epic graphical preset. So I say ray tracing, but what I mean is hardware ray tracing, because I know there's going to be someone who says it that ray tracing is always on. Yes, it's software lumen, but with the ray tracing on in the settings is hardware ray tracing. So just clarifying. But here we have the 3080 Ti averaging 60 FPS and the 6800 XT averaging 37 FPS. So the 6800 XT has actually fallen quite a bit behind. This gives the 3080 Ti a lead of around 60% on the averages. So that has doubled since previously where we had ray tracing disabled. Now for the 7900 XTX, it's actually at 68 FPS average. It's actually very similar to the 3080 Ti in performance in the forest. Right? Now that's not very unusual because when it comes to ray tracing, the 3080 Ti and 7900 XTX can actually perform very similarly, which seems to be the case right here anyway. But what about the other side? Will there be a difference? Well, let's take a look. What makes the other side quite interesting is, well, ray tracing, because it seems that AMD catches up a little for whatever reason, right? Now, it's true, we're getting overall higher FPS across the board in this. So the 3080 Ti is averaging 70 FPS, previously it was 60, and the 6800 XT is averaging 50 FPS on the other side, whereas in the Forest it was 37 FPS. That's a lead of 40% for the 3080 Ti, whereas in the Forest it was 60%. So AMD has caught up a little bit, and the 7900 XTX is averaging 85 FPS. So that's 15 FPS more than the 3080 Ti, whereas in the Forest it was only 8 FPS more. So that's kind of interesting, and the reason why I'm glad that I tested this area as well. But it's going to get even more interesting later on in the video when we look at the optimized settings. Next, we're going to take a look at 1440p, ray tracing off, and the Epic graphical preset. So at 1440p with ray tracing off, the 3080 Ti is averaging 57 FPS, and the 6800 XT is averaging 40 FPS. So that's a lead of around 43% for the 3080 Ti, with the 7900 XTX averaging 70 FPS. So a pretty nice lead there for the XTX. For the other side apartments, well, the 3080 Ti is averaging 63 FPS here versus 57 FPS in the Forest, and the 6800 XT is averaging 49 FPS here versus 40 in the Forest. That's a lead of around 30% for the 3080 Ti here in the other side apartments versus 43% in the Forest. So this is 1440p with ray tracing off. And the 7900 XTX, well, that jumps all the way up to 84 FPS average. That again is with ray tracing off, so software Lumen. Well, let's take a look at turning hardware ray tracing on. This one's kind of interesting. We're gonna stick to 1440p, ray tracing set to on, so hardware ray tracing, and the Epic graphical preset. With the hardware ray tracing on, we actually take quite a big hit on our FPS. The 3080 Ti is averaging 48 FPS, with the 6800 XT collapsing all the way to 28 FPS. That is a lead of 75% for the 3080 Ti. And the 7900 XTX, it is averaging 48 FPS, exactly the same as the 3080 Ti. Now, what makes this very interesting? Well, you will see once we take a look at the other side apartments, because again, it kind of matters the areas that you test. You can get somewhat different results for whatever reason. So then, the other side apartments, 1440p hardware ray tracing Epic graphical preset. The 3080 Ti averages 49 FPS versus 48 FPS in the Forest, so not much of a difference. The 6800 XT averages 33 FPS versus 28 FPS in the Forest. So here, the 3080 Ti has an advantage of 48%, quite a bit lower than the 75% lead it had in the Forest. But the 7900 XTX here averages 60 FPS, right? In the Forest, it was pretty much the same as the 3080 Ti. They were both at 48 FPS. But here, in the other side apartments, the 7900 XTX is at 60 FPS versus 48 FPS with the 3080 Ti. So for some reason, AMD seems to perform a bit better here in the other side apartments. Okay, so next we're going to take a look at optimized settings. So this is going to be 1440p ray tracing off with optimized settings. What is optimized settings? Well, we're going to set shadow quality to low and shaders quality to medium. So this is a really good way of getting a ton more FPS, guys, at a very little visual quality loss. I don't think you're even going to notice, but what you are going to notice is the increase in FPS. And this actually closes the gap between that 6800 XT and 3080 Ti quite a lot. As a matter of fact, we're not going to bother looking at the other side apartments. I don't want the video to be too long, but I did look at it. The differences were pretty much the same. So the 3080 Ti averages 91 FPS, and the 6800 XT averages 83 FPS. So that's an only 10% lead for the 3080 Ti with these optimized settings. The 7900 XTX, well, that blows right past with 126 FPS average at 1440p ray tracing off optimized settings. Now, even though I'm not going to insert the other side apartments, I did look at it. The 3080 Ti's advantage shrunk down from 10% to 5%. Not a huge difference. But what about ray tracing? Well, let's take a look at that. Alrighty then, so 1440p with hardware ray tracing on and optimized settings. You can use these optimized settings even with hardware ray tracing. It will give you quite a good bump in performance. With ray tracing and optimized settings, we have the 3080 Ti averaging 75 FPS and the 6800 XT 59 FPS. So that is a lead of 28% for the 3080 Ti. Quite a big difference from before with the Epic preset. The 3080 Ti had a 75% advantage. So yeah, these optimized settings help quite a bit for both AMD and Nvidia, but it seems a bit more for AMD apparently. Now the 7900 XTX did really well at 94 FPS with ray tracing on. Previously the 7900 XTX was tied to the 3080 Ti. So I'm not quite sure why lowering these two settings in particular seems to have such a nice bump in performance for AMD GPUs. For the next run, I wanted to keep the same settings, 1440p hardware ray tracing on with the optimized settings, but introduce DLSS quality and FSR quality. Let's take things as far as we can. We should get a pretty decent bump to our performance, and we do get just that. The 3080 Ti ends up averaging 87 FPS compared to 75 FPS without DLSS quality, and the 6800 XT averages 64 FPS with FSR quality versus 59 FPS at native 1440p. So not a massive gain, but a gain is a gain. That is a lead of 35% for the 3080 Ti, and the 7900 XTX averages 96 FPS. So it actually didn't gain all that much with FSR quality. Maybe we're CPU bound. So it's actually fairly close to the 3080 Ti in this particular case. Okay then, so I have one more for you guys. We're gonna target 4K this time with ray tracing off, optimized settings, and DLSS and FSR quality. Let's see what happens. And what happens is the 3080 Ti averages 72 FPS with the 6800 XT averaging 58 FPS. That is a lead of 25% for the 3080 Ti, and the 7900 XTX averages 93 FPS at 4K optimized settings, ray tracing off, DLSS and FSR quality. So as you guys can see, there's many things you can do to tweak the settings and dial in your performance to how you want. Now this game is kind of problematic even when it comes to the areas that you're at. They can perform fairly differently, and then there's the stutters, which are quite annoying. But I would suggest keeping shadow quality to low and shader quality to medium. It does give you a nice boost, and it does actually help a little bit with the stutters too. It doesn't get rid of them obviously, but it does help a little. So this is what I had for you guys. I wanted to make this comparison because I've seen the benchmarks out there, and having been playing the game, knowing that performance can vary from area to area, I wanted to provide a contrast for you guys. The forest, and then also inside, hunting those nasty things. But that's going to be it for this video, guys. Give the video a like if you liked it. Took me a little while to put this together, but I figured I want to do something different than what most people seem to be doing. But that's going to be it. I'll see you on the next one. Please subscribe if you like the content. And yeah, thanks for watching. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.